Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. This is a quote. My lovely streams have been clogged up with corpses. I cannot freely pour my waters down into the shining sea because the bodies choke me. Yet you keep killing even more, annihilating everyone. Come on, leader of troops, stop now. This is too much. That's from a new translation of the ancient Greek epic, the Iliad. It is a moment in which the river god implores Achilles to stop his murderous rampage in revenge for the killing of his closest companion, Patroclus. This new translation is done by Emily Wilson, who just a few years ago translated the Iliad's companion epic poem, The Odyssey. It made her the first woman to translate Homer's epic into the English language. Emily Wilson is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania. She joined us a few years ago to talk about the Odyssey, and I'm very happy to welcome her back to this program to talk about the Iliad. Emily Wilson, thank you so much for taking this time.
Thank you for having me again. It's a great honor to talk to you.
I enjoyed our last conversation very much, and I'm very much looking forward to this conversation. It's interesting to think about the Iliad, and I think our perception of it, because we all know of the Iliad. We've all heard of the Iliad in school and in popular culture, but I don't think many of us actually really know the Iliad. And that certainly was me for most of my life. A few years ago, I did a close reading of the Iliad and listened to some lectures as I went along with it to really try to learn it. And then, of course, in these past few days, I've been spending time with your book, and it's made me think much more about it again. And this quote I began with the river god imploring Achilles to stop his rampage. And again, Achilles, who's the hero really of the poem, is reluctant and doesn't want to fight in this war. And it's not until the killing of his companion that he gets into it. But once he does get into it, he brings a scale of destruction that is almost unimaginable. And it really, really hit me when I read the quote that I read up there with the river god. Maybe it's just the times we're living in right now. But when I think about when I did really read the Iliad, the one thing that actually stuck with me from them that I remember the most is this rampage that Achilles did, because it was just, even though it was a poem, myth, it was still shocking to me.
Yes.
How do you, tell me how you view Achilles' rampage?
It is shocking. I mean, I think it's totally shocking within the experience of the poem, and it's shocking for several reasons. One is that we wait so long for it. I mean, there are so many paradoxes about how the Iliad tells its story. And one is that the great action hero, the swift-footed Achilles, it doesn't move his feet at all for 3/4 of the poem. And he's so angry with his fellow Greek Agamemnon, and he refuses to fight in order to enable the Trojan hero Hector to make massive inroads and almost set light to the whole Greek fleet. So in a way, Achilles is causing a massacre even by not doing anything. So throughout the previous part of the poem, he's causing this massacre on his own side by refusing to fight. And then once he does come back to battle against the Trojans, as you say, when he's overwhelmed by grief and rage at the killing of Patroclus, we've seen a lot of killing in the Iliad by this point. So you might think we'll be used to it and it would just seem like, yes, more killing. How can this possibly live up to the expectation that we've got at that point? And yet it's still absolutely enthralling and shocking. And it's partly because Achilles goes across every boundary that's been established in the poem up till now about the norms of war, including he kills 12 children who are unarmed Trojan boys in the river, clogs the river with corpses, fights against the gods, fights against nature, kills suppliants who are begging for mercy who are unarmed. I mean, all these norms that the poem has set up as ideally, we don't do this even in war. Achilles goes beyond all of those things, and he's constantly unsatisfied by any killing. And he also constantly repeats the fact that he knows he's going to die soon. So in a sense, he's sort of replicating his own death and the death of Patroclus on everyone else alive on the planet.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head.
Scale, yes.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head of why it stood out to me, is because it went beyond the norms of what was even acceptable within that poem at that time. Mm-hmm. And when we think of Achilles, again, I think most people, again, know of the Iliad, but don't really know the Iliad. And you might think the hero of this epic myth is some noble figure, but that that's not what I came away with when it came to Achilles.
I mean, I think I'm misled by the modern connotations of the word hero, which of course comes from the Greek heros, but the Greek term doesn't necessarily mean morally upstanding person who wouldn't kill you. I mean, it suggests either a semi-divine person, and of course Achilles is the son of a goddess. He's more than most people. He's swifter, he's better at killing than most people are. He's very talented, and he has a perspective on things which most people don't. Does that mean he's a nice guy? No, not necessarily. It's not really about that. I mean, it's about the way. I mean, I also don't think he's a villain. I mean, I think we're led to see really deep inside, why does he feel the way he does? Why does he act the way he does? The poem presents him with compassion, and also presents us with this awareness of how utterly disastrous his actions and his inactions are for other people.
This is something that also fascinates me about the Iliad, is that who he is attacking, the Trojans and the state of Troy, city of Troy. I know this isn't a time of statehood,
Yes.
but the epic actually portrays the quote unquote enemies or people on the other side as being noble people, admirable
Absolutely.
people.
Yes. I mean, I think you might expect a Greek poem about a war of Greeks against Easterners would present the enemy as bad guys. And the Iliad absolutely doesn't do that. I mean, it presents us with these two opposing armies of humans, and then the third society in the poem, the Olympian gods, each of which is presented with deep compassion and understanding. And in certain ways, the greatest warrior of Troy, Hector, is as much the protagonist of the poem as Achilles is. And we see really deeply into why does he fight and what are his motives for that. And we also understand, his family life, his relationship with his wife, his son, his parents. We're led to really understand what's going on in Troy, as well as what's going on in the Greek encampment, and to empathize with all the characters, including the Trojans, certainly.
In your introduction, you really talk a lot about Hector and his dynamic, and this is someone else who is seen, I think, as a noble, this sort of noble person. However, your introduction really made me kind of think about that a little bit more, because his decision to go fight Achilles, in which he knew he was going to die, put everyone he loved at risk.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, I think both Achilles and Hector are presented as noble and godlike, and also very dangerous, because they're both living within this warrior society. And Hector is a dutiful person who wants to avoid being shamed, and he wants to fulfill his role as the best warrior in Troy. And doing that means that he has to keep pushing out ahead to confront the enemy, even if that means he may well increase his risk of dying, and therefore also increase the risk that the city he's defending will fall. That in defending the city, he's also risking the city. So I think that terrible paradox is really central in the poem's depiction of that central narrative of why does Hector fight? Why does he keep fighting, not defensively, but as dangerously as possible? Because that's the way to get the most glory and to fulfill his, what he sees as his destiny and his close relationship with Zeus, and the pressure that's put on him by his people is to remain glorious, even if that also means his parents and his wife are begging him to fight in a safer way so that he won't die as he does in the poem.
And it's not just for his own sake. It's because his wife is going...
He's not risking just his own life, because his whole city depends on him. And as in that heartbreaking sequence at the end of Book 6, where Andromache is begging him to fight from the wall rather than go out onto the plain, because if he dies, she knows that their baby will probably be thrown from the city walls, as was part of the myth, is that baby will die, will be killed by the Greeks. She will be enslaved, his mother will be enslaved, his father will be killed, all of the people will be killed or enslaved. His city will fall because of him trying to save it in this way that focuses on his own glory.
Honor, right? Honor is the most important.
Theos.
Theos. Is this common through Greek mythology?
It's certainly central in the Iliad, and it comes up again in Greek tragedy as well. Just the dynamics of Kleos as this dangerous kind of success, where people will risk anything for honor or prestige or reputation, And there's something wonderful about being willing to risk your life for glory. I mean, I think the Iliad certainly presents it in some ways as a very noble quest, and yet also as a quest that has a very high casualty rate. I mean, the number of deaths that occur in the Iliad through this terror of shame and desire for chaos.
The Iliad takes place in the final year of a 10-year war, the Trojan War. Well, what was there a Trojan War?
There were probably many Trojan Wars. I mean, so there's a real historic city of Troy in what's now Turkey. In the Greeks called it the Hellespont, the Dardanelles. It's a real historic site, and it was inhabited for many centuries. And we know archaeologically that it was repeatedly inhabited and then destroyed, both by natural disaster and presumably conflict. I mean, there were presumably several invasions or perhaps also civil wars in that site. So it was known to the Greek-speaking world as a city, and perhaps as a city which had been fought over. Of course, the Iliad is not a sort of literal historical account of any particular real-life conflict. It's a mythologized version of a story about a great war.
And again, this is Troy. Modern. So I always thought it was always controversial where Troy was. It's now pretty confirmed.
It's pretty much confirmed, yes. I mean, so we know that it is what the Hittites called Wilusa. That's been confirmed archaeologically, and yes, it's. I mean, the controversy that was happening in the late 19th century when the German archaeologist Heinrich Schliemann went and started excavating at what is at the site of Troy. I mean, he destroyed a lot of things while trying to dig it up and prove that it really was Homer's Troy. I mean, some of the things he said were not right. I mean, that he all of his dating was off. And as I said, he destroyed a lot of evidence while trying to prove that the Iliad was historical fact. But yes, certainly the site of Troy is in Turkey. It is that place that Schliemann and other archaeologists have been excavating.
That's interesting. Yeah, Heinrich Schliemann's a story, a really complex story in of
really
himself.
Complex story. Yes.
But yeah, but he was correct in the site.
Yes, he wasn't the first person to say that, but yes, he was correct. Yes.
Yeah. And again, these poems, the poem, the Iliad, the stories within it, and we'll talk about how we think we end up coming up with what we consider to be the Iliad. This comes, we think of ancient Greece, but this comes before when we commonly think of ancient Greece and Athens.
Yes. Exactly. So Athens wasn't. People in antiquity in later antiquity were quite surprised by how small a part the Athenians play in the story of the Iliad, because of course Athens wasn't a big settlement. The Iliad and the Odyssey are both based on centuries-long oral traditions, and during that period of archaic Greece is really a misnomer, because there were multiple different Greek-speaking settlements all over the world that's now Greece and also the west coast of Turkey. There were Greek-speaking settlements all over that area, and within the Iliad, the quote-unquote Greeks really identify themselves with their local habitation. The way that Achilles is from Thea. He's not from Greece as a whole. He doesn't necessarily identify as part of this whole sort of conglomerate of the Pan-Hellenic environment. But also the Iliad and the Odyssey were composed at a period when there was more and more sense of there should be collaboration between the different Greek settlements. So part of the premise of the Iliad is sort of exploring what would it be like if all the Greek leaders got together and did something together. The Trojan War is a sort of mythological image of an idea of Pan-Hellenism, or of Greece being a more coherent entity.
Sounds like a world war. I mean,
it sounds like a world war, and it's presented in a way like a world war. I mean, as a conflict between East and West in sort of monumental terms. And of course, by modern World War standards, it's a tiny bit of geography, but it's presented as huge. Yeah.
How does the story come down through time? How do we get the Iliad? That's a big question, because I know we're going through couple, maybe 3,000 years here of history. But how
Yes.
do we get the Iliad?
So we get the part of this taps into the Homeric question, which is the question of how did I mentioned the long oral tradition, which involved oral poets without having any knowledge of reading and writing, composing ad lib stories based on formulaic phrasing and a traditional meter, dactylic hexameter, telling stories about the great mythical wars of Thebes and of Troy. Then at some point in the mid-8th century, Greece developed a writing system. And then probably fairly soon after that, the Homeric poems were composed using this new technology of writing. So maybe in the early 7th century BCE, they were composed as these monumental written things based on the oral tradition, but using this new technology of writing. Of course, we don't have, and exactly when that happened is controversial. Exactly how that happened is controversial. Was it that an oral poet became literate? Was it dictated? How exactly did that happen? Without a time machine, I'm not sure quite how we would decide that. And then those poems existed, I think, as written artifacts which circulated, but they were still, for many centuries, experienced primarily orally. So there were figures called rhapsodes who would learn the Homeric poems by heart and do showing off dramatic performances of a section of the Iliad as evening entertainment. Of course, you can't do the whole thing as an after dinner thing or even as a festival thing, but here's a scene from the Iliad as entertainment and as part of a religious or civic festival. Then in the 2nd and 3rd century BCE, there was the Library of Alexandria, where there were these scholars, Greek-speaking scholars, who were gathered in this Greek Egyptian city, who were sort of taking on the task of trying to put together authorized texts of the canonical works of Greek literature, of existing Greek literature. And so the texts that we have of the Iliad and the Odyssey are based on the work of those scholars in the Library of Alexandria. So we have papyri from that era, which are the earliest bits of the Homeric text that we have. Most of the complete texts are based on medieval manuscripts, which were copies of those initial texts by the scholars of Alexandria.
Are there different versions of the story?
There are as with any ancient text, there are textual variants. So, for instance, in the beginning of the Iliad, we know that some ancient versions said that the bodies of those killed in the war would become a feast for all the birds, or would be eaten by all the birds, or else would be a feast for the birds. So it's a slight verbal variation. Is it oionoisi de tepasi or oionoisi te daita? So that's a one-word variation. There's quite a lot of those kinds of one-word variation, or there's a quotation in Plato, which is slightly different from the received text that we have. We don't have a version of the Iliad that's totally different. We don't have a version that's here in this version, Hector didn't die, or in this version, Achilles didn't get mad at all. That doesn't exist. And I don't think it would really be the Iliad if it was that. We do have evidence about other bits of the epic tradition, which were telling other bits of the story. So, for instance, we have a summary and a quotation from a poem called the Cypria, which started with telling about the plan of Zeus to relieve Earth of the burden of too many people, and then it presumably told a different version of how did the whole Trojan War come about. And there were presumably other epic poems about different elements of the mythic cycle, but we only have fragments and summaries of those.
Yeah, that's interesting to me. Recently, we had on religious scholar Bart Ehrman, and we talked about the history of the Bible, and it was sort of mind-blowing to me because you think of the Bible as a book, a single book, and he's like, no, it's many books that some people decided to turn into a single book, but there were many books from before. Some got into the final Bible that we call the Bible, some didn't, and I was wondering if that's sort of a common way that stories come to us and as a collection, and if that at all rang true for the Iliad.
So some people argue that, so for instance, with the Iliad, book 10 is weird. because it's the only book in which the fighting takes place at night rather than during the daylight hours. And it features Odysseus and Diomedes sneaking into the Trojan camp and slaughtering Rhesus and stealing his horses. And it has various verbal peculiarities. So some people argue maybe this is a later insertion into the poem. Maybe the poem existed in some form already, and then somebody thought we can add in this exciting night raid episode and just plug it in there. I mean, that's debatable, though, because it also relies on a sort of a whole set of assumptions about how much was this poem sort of fully existing as a complete thing before this other bit got started into it. Does it work like that? I mean, I think it's actually a little bit different from the Bible, because in the case of, I mean, we know about how like Genesis is put together out of pre-existing written sources, sort of cut and paste, which is different from a poem that's put together out of an oral tradition, where the pieces of the oral tradition don't exactly sort of exist as I'm going to cut out that bit and put it in there. It's all part of the poet's memory, and you can compose through things you remember, but you're not exactly quoting if you're doing it in a way that's sort of pre-literate. So I'm not sure if it's quite the same thing.
This is Letters and Politics, and we are in conversation with Emily Wilson. Emily Wilson is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and she joins us to talk about her new translation of the Iliad. Something else I find really fascinating is that within the Iliad, you find hints of other stories that maybe we don't have anymore. Mm-hmm. But obviously people then knew of the stories because they reference the stories without telling you them. They just sort of reference them so everyone already knows what they are.
Yes. Yes, I find that fascinating too. I mean, the Iliad, as I think we've already said in certain ways, is a very surprising take on the Trojan War story, because it doesn't have the beginning of the war, it doesn't have the end of the war. As we already said, it doesn't focus on Greeks versus Trojans, but Greeks versus Greeks. But it has all these allusions to stories that aren't central or that are in the background. So, for instance, we have these allusions to the first Trojan War, when Heracles sacked Troy, which is a story that may be unfamiliar to many modern readers, but the audience is clearly assumed to know all about what happened when Heracles went to Troy. I mean, a lot of these stories that are the most famous stories for both in antiquity and in modern culture, like the Trojan horse, we know about those only from much later sources, but they're clearly implied within Homer, is that you're going to know about the Trojan horse. You're going to know about how did the Greeks sack the city, but we're not going to bore you by telling you the famous bits. We're going to tell you the bits that are unexpected.
I'm going to quote your translation once again, and this is another moment that I really remember, and it was vivid to me even as I read it. And this is when, after Achilles kills Hector, Achilles is brutal to Hector's body, doesn't allow for the traditional and expected funeral rites to happen, keeps the body, drags it wherever he goes, keeps the body with himself. Eventually, the king of Troy, Priam, the father of Hector, comes to Achilles, asks for the body of Achilles, which Achilles gives it back to him. And their conversation is, to me, a very profound and touching conversation. And Achilles says this to Priam, King Priam, quote, Now your son has been released to you, just as you ask. He lies upon a bier, and when dawn shows her light, you will see him yourself and take him home. But now we need to turn our minds to dinner. Remember, even noble Niobe took thought of food, although she lost 12 children. It's a much longer quote, too long for me to read here. A couple things there were interesting to me. This, again, this just straight destruction that happens for so long, and now it's time to stop and eat. But also the mention of Niobe. I'm assuming people would have known who Niobe was.
Exactly, yes. People would have known who Niobe was, and that same speech also alludes to the idea that there's a particular rock face on Mount Sipylus, which has a waterfall running down it, and the local myth was that that's Niobe turned to stone, and she's weeping forever because she lost all her children. And so presumably it's also relying both on general mythic knowledge and perhaps also local topographical knowledge of, you may know Mount Sipylus by, you've heard of the Weeping Rock. And I mean, it's both a myth you're supposed to know, and yet you also don't necessarily need to know it, because Achilles tells the story, and he tells explicitly to Priam. I mean, part of so much of the talking and the teaching in the Iliad happens through stories, and through that story, he's saying both that grief does last forever because she's turned to stone, she's never going to stop crying, and yet she also has to eat. If you're going to be alive as a human, you have to eat, and you have to find some kind of connection with the people you live with. Even though, terrible things happen, the people you love may all be killed.
Turn to stone. I mean, it almost sounds metaphoric. That's
certainly, yes. I mean, I think also because, there's this sort of repeated trope of what is it to be a human being as opposed to being made of a hard object. I mean, Paris says that to Hector, that he's like an axe. And within the conversation of Hector and Achilles before Achilles kills Hector, there's also that trope of, is your heart made of iron? And Priam is also told, your heart must be made of iron, that you could dare to come through the enemy camp. So in a way, the heroes in this poem have to have iron hearts or stone faces, and yet they also have to be able to weep and be able to eat.
You mentioned Paris. Obviously, this is an important figure.
Yes.
The war is, you could say, is it because of the beauty contest between the goddesses? When does the war really begin? But you could put a starting point of the war of when Helen, the wife of Menelaus, my assumption was always fell in love with Paris. They fell in love with each other, and that she willingly left Sparta, I think, Helen of Sparta. She left Sparta and went to Troy with Paris. However, in reading your introduction, I got the sense that she might have been kidnapped.
I think the Iliad itself gives you that sense of ambiguity about it, because in Book 3 of the Iliad, we have what in a way is a replay of the story that the poem doesn't give us, of that initial how did Helen go off with Paris. And in that sequence, there's a duel between Paris and Menelaus. Aphrodite loves Paris, scoops him off the battlefield, saves him, and plonks him down in the bedroom, and then tells Helen she has to go to bed with him. And Helen very clearly says, I don't want to go. It's embarrassing. He's an embarrassment. I don't want to go with him. He's obviously attractive, but it doesn't look good, and it's not what I want to be doing. And the goddess dominates her and leads her to bed with him. So we're presented with a Helen who, you could read that scene and think maybe Aphrodite is an allegorical representation of lust. Maybe she's overwhelmed by my desire. Or you could read it and think this shows that this human being doesn't have a choice. She's forced into something that she doesn't want to do. And she tells Aphrodite very explicitly that, like the male warriors, she cares about honor and reputation. And it's not a good way to increase your honor and reputation to be in bed with Paris.
And is that something you got by going back to the Greek original text?
Yes, I think the Iliad certainly goes out of its way to present Helen as this complicated character. Like, we're not told in the poem that it's sort of unambiguously clear that Helen decided to go. We're never told that even by any other characters, let alone by the narrator. We're told repeatedly that Helen seems to regret being there, and also we're told in that scene that I just talked about that she doesn't want to go to bed with him.
I had this sort of Romeo and Juliet essence of them. Was I alone in that, or is this idea that she was kidnapped sort of commonly accepted?
I'm not sure that it's an ambiguity. There's ambiguity about whether it's kidnapped or is it. I also said, it depends partly how we read the goddess, right? How do we understand the actions of the gods in the poem? If we really think we're supposed to believe in them as real forces, then she's kidnapped by the goddess as much as by Paris. I think it's also the case that some modern depictions of the Helen and Paris story reduce the ambiguities that are there in the Iliad's depiction of it. I mean, in the Iliad, there's also, I think, another thing to bear in mind is that what's at stake when the Greeks and Trojans are discussing having a duel to see if they can resolve the war without more casualties, they repeatedly say, if Menelaus wins, then Paris has to give back Helen and all the property, and all the property, and that phrase recurs. So if we sort of see that in that phrasing, Helen is being treated as part of the property, the property doesn't choose to go. Paris in that way is a thief rather than he's as much a thief as an adulterer. So I don't know. I mean, obviously, within later texts in antiquity, there were a whole range of different ways to depict Helen. There was also an ancient myth that said she never went to Troy at all. It was the gods made a ghost that looked like Helen, who was the one over whom the whole war was fought. Which is, of course, a myth that allows for exploration of, is war always fought for nothing? Is it always fought for an image or a word? In that myth, which Euripides wrote a really great play about, called the Helen, she spends the whole war in Egypt.
Yeah. In preparing for our conversation, I was like, "Where's that line? How did Emily Wilson translate the line, the face that launched 1,000 ships?" And as I was looking for that, I realized, it's not in there at all. That was Christopher Marlowe.
Yes, exactly. And of course, that's within that play, she's a representation of sexual desire as an anti-Christian temptation, which is, of course, not what the Iliad is doing with that character. It's a very in a way, it's an anachronistic thing to put back onto the Iliad.
And Christopher Marlowe is a contemporary of Shakespeare, so obviously much later. If I can come back to Achilles and some of the words that you choose to use, I found one that was interesting that you use continually, and I think purposefully, deliberately, and that was wrath. Achilles' wrath. Tell me about the importance of the word wrath for you.
Yes, so the first word of the poem in the original is menin, from menis. The poem has there are several different Greek terms for anger or rage. The normal word for human anger is cholos, which is related to the word we get melancholy from, which is black rage. So cholos is the normal way that humans get angry with each other. The choice of menace marks Achilles' wrath as something different, because that word is usually used for the wrath of gods, which is why I choose wrath, because I think it has a biblical connotation, which sounds more like divine anger than human anger. And that word comes up repeatedly in relation to the wrath of Achilles, and there are several cognates, which I also translate consistently with wrath and wrathful. I think the difference between Achilles' rage and those of normal mortals is that Achilles' rage has the capacity to cause vastly more harm. I mean, if a man is angry, I mean, we see a lot of angry men in the Iliad causing a lot of damage, and if men are angry with each other in a normal way, they may kill several other men, but they don't cause the deaths of thousands of other people by not doing anything, which is what happens with the wrath of Achilles, that even though he's absent from the battlefield, and yet because of his wrath, so many people die. So in a way, it's like the wrath of Apollo, which we also see at the start of the Iliad, where Apollo is enraged at the abduction of the priest's daughter, Chryseis, and as a result of that, he shoots the arrows of plague through the Greek camp, and so many people can die through plague, because Apollo is the sun god and the plague god. And in a way, Achilles' wrath is like that. It's something spreading almost like a divine or natural phenomenon.
For you, do you see the Iliad to be about anything? I mean, obviously it's about a Trojan War, but about some particular theme. Do you think it's about conflict? Do you think it's about grief? I suspect it's about a lot of things.
I think it's about a lot of things, yes. I mean, I think it's about the intertwining of rage and grief and how closely those emotions go together, and the momentous consequences of those emotions specifically, that we constantly see how being deprived of something or someone, either Achilles being deprived of honor in the first quarrel, or being deprived of Patroclus in the second sequence of his wrath, or Hector fearing the loss of honor, like these fears of loss or the experience of loss provokes grief, which then provokes rage, because men who experience loss want to get it back, or at least get revenge if they can't. So that cycle of rage, which then is going to cause more grief, which is going to cause more rage. And then I think also that the central theme of human mortality, and partly because the gods, the immortals, are so central in the poem, we get so much of a clear sense of how similar gods are to mortals in so many ways, except for the fact that they don't die. And the Iliad teaches us over and over again that this fundamental element of humanity is that the spear can pierce you anywhere and you'll die.
You have this great line in your introduction. Hector believes, let me say it again. Hector believed he had the protection of deities, which is never a safe assumption.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. And so, I mean, Hector thinks he has Zeus on his side, which is only partly true, because Zeus has agreed that while Achilles is sitting out of the battle, Hector will triumph. But of course, that's not a forever thing. It's not that Zeus is going to save Hector. Of course, he's not. And even Achilles, who has his sea goddess mother on his side, she wants to restore his lost honor. But in doing that, she, enables the death of Patroclus and shortens his life.
I mean, I just think there's some wisdom there. Everyone always
Absolutely.
thinks they have God on their side, or a God,
Everyone
or whatever
thinks
it may
that they
be.
could get lucky, or there's something special about them. And maybe there is something special about all of us, and yet we're still going to die. And the gods might not be as much on our side as we think. I mean, even Aphrodite is so close to Helen, but that doesn't mean she's going to do what she wants.
What do you think the Iliad says about the ancient world?
Oh, that's such a big question. I'm not sure where to start with that. I mean, I think it presents this world which is both so different and so familiar. I mean, if it's a question about just how different is the ancient world from the modern world, I mean, in some ways it's very, very different, right? I mean, there's animal sacrifice. There's all these different ways that, even just imagining what is a body, it's a collection of knotted limbs together while we're alive, and then the limbs unravel. There's something quite alien about a lot of the way the story is told. And of course, most of us don't believe in the Olympian gods anymore, and it's quite different. And yet at the same time, the emotions and the interactions of characters are very, it's very possible to get oneself to empathize with them and understand how they feel and how they interact with each other. So I think it shows you both how distant the ancient world is and also how comprehensible it can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think this dynamic that you talked about rage and grief is pretty profound.
I think so too.
Yes. And that's a clear theme.
Absolutely,
purposeful theme through
yes.
the Iliad.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, the Iliad's also full of insults, isn't it?
It is, yes, it is. And which is, I mean, I laugh because I think some of them are some of the most enjoyable elements of the poem are the inventiveness of the insults. And in that great quarrel sequence in Book 1 of Achilles and Agamemnon slinging insults at each other, I mean, it's both horrifying and intense, but also almost black comedy. And also, I mean, I think there's something fascinating about how the Iliad both feels very, very real. I mean, in its depictions of what does it feel like to be on the battlefield, either as a killer or the killed, or in its depictions of grief and family dynamics. But it's also so stylized because in most battles, presumably also in antiquity, people are constantly pausing on the battlefield. Everyone's wearing full armor, and yet before you throw the spears, we're going to have a long speech with insults, and or there's going to be a long speech of you guys have to go into battle, and let me give you a long speech telling you why. I mean, I think on some level that's also totally unrealistic, and yet it also speaks to the way that action is built out of emotions and out of language, and we live in a world where we're very aware of how people are dominated by or shaped by media, and in the Iliad people are shaped by rhetoric and form each other's actions and define their own actions by rhetoric, and they're always Achilles and Hector are both extremely aware that their lives are going to be short, but what they'll have afterwards, if they're lucky, is going to be both a funeral and a memorial mound and a place in this story, in this poem.
I suspect the insults and the comedy also give us insight into the people of the ancient world.
Absolutely, yes. And the insults also speak to the kinds of pressure that these people in a warrior society are putting on each other, that very often the insults have to do with either like, or the urgings to fight very often have to do with a leader saying be men, and then the insults very often have to do with you're not being sufficiently manly, you're like a gymnast, you're like an acrobat, you're not like a proper warrior. There's something there's some way that you're not fulfilling your proper role, and you should be humiliated by that set of tropes.
The Iliad in Greek is very rhythmic.
Mm-hmm.
You wanted your translation to have its own sort of rhythm.
Absolutely, yes. So my primary goal in doing these Homeric translations was feeling frustrated that so many modern translations of Homer don't use meter in English, whereas the originals used dactylic hexameter. They were usually experienced out loud in antiquity, performed and made dramatic and also musical. They may have been strumming along to the lyre while performing these poems. So they have this beat. You can sort of tap your feet to the beat. So I used a very regular iambic pentameter to try to evoke that experience for the Anglophone reader of a rhythm that sort of cues you into this is traditional in this language, just as dactylic hexameter was the traditional way of telling poetic metrical narrative in archaic Greece.
I think a lot of translations that we have gotten over time in the last 100, 200 years, I don't know, recently, let's say in recent history, that they're really formal. Whereas my understanding of the original Greek is actually not formal at all. It's very sort of straightforward talk, speech.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, I think it's formal it's metrical, and it has a register that isn't quite like real speech. It has an artifice and a sense of poetic artifice to it. So it's not necessarily chatty, but it has a very, very great clarity and rapidity and directness. And the syntax is designed to be easily comprehensible out loud. So it's not difficult syntactically. It's not full of sort of long subordinate clauses. It's not like Paradise Lost, where you sort of have these subordinate clause within subordinate clause within subordinate clause. In Homer, it's very much coordinated syntax, where and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and it's all being told within a metrical poetic register and with some diction that probably wasn't ever part of real conversational chatty speech. There are ways that I'm sure that in real life people didn't say his limbs are knotted and his spirit, the bronze jangled round him as he fell. I mean, there are ways that the diction, I'm sure people on the street weren't talking about cataclysmic wrath or ulomoner menis. So there are ways that it's poetic and marked as poetic, but it's also not unclear, and it's very direct, and there's a way that it's not designed to be obscure.
There's also these long lists through the Iliad
yes.
that can be laborious to read. But these were meant to be songs?
Well, not exactly a song, but the distinction between poetry and song, maybe there isn't as sharp a distinction as we might think between a poem and a song. I think the lists make much more sense if you remember that they're designed for oral performance, and they're designed to be a sonic experience as much as an experience of memory and of virtuosic storytelling technique. And it's also a way of evoking the whole world. I mean, the catalogue of ships sort of showcases the way this is like a world war, because it's showing us a sort of verbal map of the whole Greek-speaking world.
And finally, are obviously the Iliad and the Odyssey are closely related. Are they of the same story? Do you think they are the same? Are they connected? Are they different stories? How would you describe the relationship of them?
I think they're very closely connected. I mean, I think the chances are that the Iliad, whether or not we think it's a single composer who made both of them, I think the Iliad, I think they seem to answer each other. I think the Odyssey was probably composed with close knowledge of the Iliad. I mean, the fact that the Odyssey doesn't replicate the Iliad, but then they also tell these parallel stories, the stories of war and of homecoming and of the the ways that the Trojan War impacts both Troy and then in the Odyssey, the whole of the rest of the world. I think they also both have this sort of parallel structure in terms of both focusing on a single elite warrior who gets separated from his community. So, of course, in the Odyssey, that's Odysseus, who's separated from his community and has to be reintegrated into the community of Ithaca. And that problem of how can the separated warrior get back? And that's the story of the Odyssey, is how does he get back? In the Odyssey, it's through this sort of dynamic of homecoming, disguise, recognition, hospitality. In the Iliad, Achilles is separated from his Greek-speaking community throughout the first section of the poem, and then he's separated in a way from all of humanity in the final sequence of the poem until that meeting of Priam and Achilles. So it's this story of how does the alone, isolated warrior come back? And that same story happens with Hector, even though he comes back only once he's dead.
Emily Wilson has been our guest. Again, Emily Wilson is a professor of classical studies at the University of Pennsylvania, and she has joined us for a conversation about her new translation of the Iliad. Emily Wilson, I've enjoyed our conversation very much, and I thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.